When I think of my roofing business, there's many things that go into an eight-figure roofing company that when you think of a smaller roofing company, like you don't need that level of detail just yet. So when I think of a roofing business, just off the top of my head, the things that any roofing business should be focused on, should be looking at, there are four major areas, and those would be marketing, sales, production, and then just about everything else will sum up under finance. And so if we go back to the beginning to marketing, the three things that I've written down that I can think of that are extremely important. One is leads, one is appointments, because some people make them the same thing, but they're not. You may have bad leads that never make it to appointments, and you need to fix the first so you have more of the second. And then the last one would be brand. So that is a major topic that we'll go into in future videos. But leads, appointments, and brand are all under marketing and are things that any business should focus on. So the next one would be sales. And the first one I can think of is the sales process, the number of quotes given, and then ultimately the closing percentage. And we'll talk about that in more detail, but these are the things that I think of under each area of the business, the major KPIs or numbers that if you're a smaller roofing company, you need to start focusing in on, because as you get bigger, they become more and more important. But if you're running a healthy business, it's more and more exciting because you can manipulate little things in the sales process and you'll get better outcomes in other areas. And so the third area is production. Okay. And this is where everything lives and dies. So you've got great marketing, you build a beautiful sales process and you're closing deals. And then now it gets to production. And they have to fulfill and uphold all of the promises that you made in the sales department. And so in production, we have three major things that I can think of off the top of my head. One of them is prep and scheduling. One of them is the build day or the day of, everything that goes into that. And then the third thing would be the closeout. And that is once the roof replacement is done and the material is all like, you've got your returns set aside, then you have to run your magnet. And the most important thing is the communication with the homeowner to prep them for what is next, which is usually the billing. And that leads us to the fourth area of the business, which is finance. Okay. And this has everything to do with the money and the assets of the business. And under that category, I think there was four things that I really thought of. Well, the first one of them is accounts receivable. So going back to production, that closeout conversation prepares them for an invoice that becomes accounts receivable, which is we send an invoice to a homeowner and they need to give us money. The amount of money that they need to give us is our accounts receivable. The next one would be accounts payable. And this is one of the major issues in our roofing industry, especially with smaller companies, that because we deal with such high tickets, $10, $15, $20,000, they may get a large accounts receivable. Let's say it's $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, but then they don't think that we still have to pay the supplier for all of the material, and we have to pay the subcontractor or the in-house crew for the overhead and all of the pay and expenses associated with doing the project. And your accounts payable is how much do we need to pay those people? So accounts receivable is here. Dave Ramsey talks about this. We want more money coming in than money going out. And so if you have a large bank account, plus accounts receivable, because this is money essentially that we just need to collect because work is done. And then accounts payable is, let's say down here, if you've got lots of money and a high accounts receivable and your accounts payable is very low or within net 30, or even better, like we run things under net 30 in Andy's Roofing, then you're in a very good spot as a company. So under finance, we have accounts receivable, we have accounts payable, and then the next one, which kind of encompasses a lot, is expense tracking. This is very important as a smaller company, is that as you grow, this becomes a major priority for your back-end office support, that you need to be tracking expenses on a per job basis. Okay, as you get larger, there becomes this like I don't know if it's just like an ideology. Part of it is just happenstance. It just becomes this way. But we start talking about cash flow management. We start talking about the ebbs and flows. All of those ebbs and flows and the cash flow management all come back to individual job costs that create gross profit that then feeds back into the business. And until you are a very large size, $10 million plus, each individual job, if your profitability on that job, on the job level, it starts to dip. Let's say you're below 30% margin, 35%, 40, whatever your benchmark is. If it starts to dip and go down, it does not take very many jobs that are like 25% before your average profitability starts to really fall off. And the best way to, or I guess the way that you need to track all of that is expense tracking. So this is getting an office admin in the back office that's doing reconciling, basically making sure transactions are what they're supposed to be and they're going to the jobs that they're supposed to go to. That way we can say John Smith's roof replacement had X amount of material, X amount of labor equals so much profit. Okay. And if we're not tracking expenses, which would be reconciling them or expensing them back to that specific job, it gets lost in the minutia of this is what our accounts payable is, but then we're getting this much money. And those things don't come back and they don't correlate unless you take it all the way back to the per job basis and say, I made this much exactly on this job. This is this average profit margin. And then this is this job. And then this is this average profit margin. Now we put them together and really that's where you get your average profit margin from. And then now we can say above the line, which is what I call you have all of your gross revenue. So we have all of our gross revenue minus gross expenses or expenses. Then you get your gross profit. Okay, so we want to get that percentage. And then once we get that percentage, then you go into your other area of finance, which is your human assets. Okay, so whenever people think about money, they think of like, oh, finances, accounts receivable, accounts payable, it's making sure the transactions are right and all of that. But then you have to think of your other largest expense in the business, which would be payroll, benefits, expenses that tied around those things, which are your human assets. That is your HR or your human resources. So I put that under finance because so much money is outlaid for those things. You are investing in those employees. They are investing back into the future of the business. And so to recap all of this, we have the 4 areas that I can think of any roofing business, and that would be marketing, sales, production, and finance. And underneath of all of those, we're going to get into more detail in future videos about closing percentage and quotes given and sales process in general. And then I'm going to get very specific about it and other areas of the business, marketing, and then, operations. How many roofs are you doing this week? How much gross profit margin are you making? What is your number of squares that you need to get? What's your average per square? All of those things are very important in a business, but to start, we got to simplify. And then we start getting more and more specific as we scale and get more and more people to come alongside of us and help us in our business. And then we can get more granular. But don't overcomplicate something that's not very complicated. So learn how to back out of it, look at the 4 areas, and then we'll dive back in and we'll talk about how we break this down and start tracking our businesses the way it should be.